Okay, so I'm going to play this audio here.
Chapter 2 of the Holy Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion. There is no force because it defeats the purpose. If I got to put a sword to your throat to make you believe in what I believe in, then that's not true faith.
Stop there. Chapter 2 of the Quran does not just say La iqra fil deen. There's a lot of ayat in that chapter. Kutiba alaykum al-qital is in there. You're obligated to fight. So it's not just La iqra fil deen. And so that's kind of the crux of the problem of this guy's argument. You can't go around and just pick and choose things.
Right.
So
if I got to put a sword to your throat to make you believe in what I believe in, then that's not true faith. Every time the word infidel is mentioned in the Quran, it's talking about the pagan Arabs that were trying to exterminate the Prophet.
I think this is not true. Let's go see if I can find a quick example. Kufar just means it means someone who rejects something.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what it's talking about. Someone who's rejecting, he's a disbeliever, he denies something. That's what it means. So it's a general term, and it's used all over the place, and it's used for people all over the place in the Quran. So let me look up. I could probably just search for the word and find one where it applies to Christians. If you want.
Yeah.
Or we can go through chapter 9 where where the Quran details the Christians are the mushrikeen, which he'll probably go into and say this is talking about fighting the mushrikeen. So if you want, which way do you want to go with that?
Yeah, let's look at examples of where kufar applies to Christians, not just pagan Arabs. Let's kind of refute that idea, and then we'll get into the concept of the mushrik.
So let's look at chapter 9, verse 30. Let's try that one. This is directly after he says something that just flies in the face of what he's trying to push. Because, yes, the first verse of the chapter the fifth verse of the chapter 9 starts out saying something about the mushrikeen. It says, let me pull it up here. إِذَا أَنْسَلَخَ الْشَارُ الْخُرُمْ فَاقْتُلُوا مُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثَ وَجَدْتُهُمْ. Once the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Mushrikeen, polytheists. Unless they, of course, repent and do the prayers and so on and so forth. That's how the ayat goes. Then you go to verse 29, and it expands this war and who they're supposed to fight, right? And it includes the people he's trying to say it doesn't involve. So that doesn't make sense. قَاتِلُوا الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. Fight those who don't believe in God and the day of judgment, last day of judgment. لَا يُحَرَمُ مَنْ حَرَمَ اللَّهُ. That don't, forbid the things that God forbids. Allah وَرَسُولُهُ وَلْيُدِينُ دِينَ الْحَقِّ. Those who don't judge based on a true judgment. And it says, min allazina utul kitab, amongst those who have received the scripture. So this is Jews and Christians here. Let's fight the Jews and Christians. Hatta ya'til jizya, until they give the jizya tax an yaddin wa hum saghirun. So that showing that they're humiliated. So until it's subdued. So they are commanded in this particular verse to fight the Jews and Christians. The next verse continues and is going to probably call them الذين كفروا. So let's see what it says here. It says قالت اليهود عزير ابن الله. It says the Jews say that Ezra is the son of God. وقالت النصارى المسيح ابن الله. And the Christians say that the Messiah is the son of Allah. Right there we know what's going to follow. And that in and of itself is considered kufar and rejecting and denying the truth in the Muslim sphere. So
it's defining.
That's the words of their own mouths, he says. Yeah, there it is. He says الذين كفروا. So they calls them in verse 930. It says that they're disbelievers. They're only parroting the words of the disbelievers.
And so the Quran is placing Christians and Jews in that category. Now, the Jews don't
Like, it's even worse than that. This 929 is a command to go and fight the Jews and Christians. Then he's justifying these things in this context when you read the verses. And then 930, it's the next verse. It says that the reason, like, he goes and justifies this in the sense that he says, well, the Jews, the people of the book called the Jews, they consider Uzair the son of God, and that's kufar. And the Christians say that Jesus is the son of God. They're just parroting the words of the kufar, right? So.
Now, obviously, there's no historic evidence of the Jews elevating Ezra to that status, but Christians do refer to Jesus as the Son of God. So this is a blanket statement for all Christians, but to me, it doesn't make sense unless he heard a very small sect of Jews elevating or claiming that Ezra was some sort of Son of God figure. But he would have heard the Christians doing it, speaking about Jesus this way. And so at some point in the development of his understanding of Christian teaching, because he did interact with Christians early on, at some point, he decided that this title, Son of God, he was just going to reject outright and then categorize Christians in this. But why would he bring the Jew? Is he only referring to, I guess what I'm getting at, in the context, would a Muslim say, well, he's only referring to a certain group of Christians, not all Christians? Because they would say that about the Jews, right? Not all Jews believe that, only a group. And I've had interaction with guys like Saeed who told me that. It was just a group of Christians.
Well, that doesn't mean... Just because the context was talking about specific people, every verse of the Quran is going to come down in a context about something that's going on. That's how it happened.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to other contexts, right? Like they extrapolate these things, the jurists do, to know what they're supposed to do. These are examples to follow for me, so to speak. So in verse 30 and 31, though, like the whole argument falls apart because he defines in verse 30, Christians are parroting the words of the kuffar. So they're committing, the alazina kafaru. They're the ones that are rejecting. They're denying. And then in the next verse, in verse 31, he calls them amma yushrikun. So that means that they associated these other peoples with him. So verse 30, he says that they're the kuffar, and then verse 31, he calls them mushrikeen. So, no, the verses in the Quran commanding to fight the mushrikeen were expanded and included other people among the Jews and Christians who they also considered being mushrikeen.
Not just the pagan polytheist of the day. So the category. So this guy is just...
So you can take, if the problem with these types of people that are just pulling things out of the Quran is you can pick out whatever you want, right? You can pick out the verses about jizya, you can pick out the verses about kill the kuffar, and there's all sorts of things that they could have done. You could kill Christians based on the fact that you consider them to be mushrikeen, because they say Jesus is the Son of God, or that God is one of three, or of these things, just things we find in the Quran. You can consider them mushrikeen if you want to. You can look at the other verses that say, if they're from the Ahl Kitab, and say, well, no, they can pay jizya and get off the hook. Or you can pick out other verses that are from different periods of time when he had cordial relations with some of these Jewish tribes, and say, look how peaceful he was. But the whole thing is like, context is important, but chronology is key to understanding what is relevant and what applies.
Right.
You can't just jump over that. So that's why I always suggest to people, whenever they're reading through the Quran, let's figure out where this falls in chronology. And so that's why people reading the Sirah and things, that really helps. Otherwise, you're just picking and choosing things.
And so essentially, though, so that's basically what he's doing. What if a Christian goes and just picks and chooses passages to try to prove a point, Muslims would rightly call that out and say, well, there's context to that. But what you're saying is this guy is doing that very thing, but he's not taking the entire concept of what is being presented in the Quran. First, he's being dishonest with what the Quran is actually saying.
He's actually just taking one point. He's saying, verse 9:5 in the Quran, when it says, فَقْتُلُوا mushrikeen kayfa wajadtuhum. Whenever it says kill the mushrikeen wherever you find them, it is talking about the mushrikeen, the Qurayshi tribe, right?
Okay.
But like few ayat later, like the 29th verse, he says, fight those who do not believe in Allah in the last day, nor comply with Allah what his messenger have forbidden, nor embrace the religion of truth among those who are given the scripture. We're talking about Jews and Christians now, until they pay the tax willingly or submitted fully. Then it goes on, the next verse right after that continues to say, oh, may Allah condemn them. How can they be deluded from the truth? Because they are parroting the words of the disbelievers, right? And then in verse 31, it goes on to say, it glorified is he above what they associate him with. The word associate right there is yushrikun. So that's what mushrik comes from. So he calls them he says, fight the Jews and Christians in verse 29, calls them kufar in verse 30, and in verse 31 he calls them mushrikeen in the same chapter. So pulling out that particular thing doesn't prove his point.
Right.
It's only a good rhetorical point if you don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. Which I've seen a lot of videos from this guy that seems that he doesn't know what he's talking about.
And like I said, like the key problem with all this is that just because you know the context, right, doesn't mean that it only applies to that context.
Right. So like Islamic jurists can credibly and legitimately take this as a principle and apply it to modern times.
They do apply it to modern times. Like this verse, the first chapter, this particular chapter is a good example. So when we go to 9:5, right, like it describes how they're supposed to go about fighting, right? They continue to do this when they were attacking Jewish tribes in other places, right? This same type of formula that we find here. What is it? We see so he says, fight them wherever you find them and capture them, right? And ambush them and if they repent and perform prayers and give the alms tax, then you can let them go. That's kind of the formula we see elsewhere. Okay. So like when you get down to 29, he just basically adds more to it. He adds in the jizya tax. You fight them, but if they pay you the jizya tax, then you can take that and give them their
Explain the
lives.
jizya tax, because is that protection money? Basically, I've heard Muslims just say, well, the jizya tax is if we're in charge, then it's actually a good thing because it means you don't have to fight. We will take care of you. We'll protect you. It's just protection money, and it's legitimate. Politically speaking, sure. If you're in charge, if you take over a nation, you do whatever you want. You can implement whatever.
Yeah, that's just kind of like, trying to make it seem nice and stuff. Right. But really, it's quite clear here. It says, "Yalta jizya an yaddin wa hum sagirun." Sagirun, it's like they're humiliated.
Okay.
Right. So if they accept a lesser status, like you have to have the Muslims, if you see in chapter 3, verse 28, you'll see that it's not permissible for any kufar to be in a position of authority over a Muslim unless there's no way around it, right?
Okay.
Like that's not the way it should be.
Right.
And so this is a way of subduing them. If they accept their lesser status in the community, and this lesser status is kind of like marked by this jizya tax. This is a way they're showing that they're humiliated. They accept that they're what would you call that?
Subdued.
I accept that they're a subdued. Yeah. They're subdued. They accept that. Then they won't come after them and kill them. But there's a lot of things that come with that. Like Khalifa Omar, he, amongst other things, when he applied this, he said you couldn't fix up your churches. Okay. You can't build new churches. You can't prevent your children from studying the Quran. If the Muslim comes to your house, you have to give them a place to sleep and something to eat. You can't go around, can't bury your dead with our dead. And all, but there's a whole bunch of stipulations separating. You can't dress the same way we do. They have to be clearly distinguished as a separate group from the
Okay.
Muslims.
Right.
And you can't prevent your kids from becoming Muslim, but you can't proselytize and so on and so forth. It's a kind of way of making them Ahl Zimmi, this particular group that you're kind of squeezing slowly until they kind of disintegrate into the Muslim community.
Okay.
That would be the way I describe it.
I see.
You can put makeup on it all you want, but it's better than death.
Right.
Yeah, like let's just be honest here. The options were if you resist the Muslims, then you're to be fought and killed, and if you accept it, then you get a lesser status, and you probably lose several generations down some of your family to attrition.
Okay.
Right. Or you accept Islam, right? That's the options here, and that's what we're talking about. That is compulsion.
Right.
Right.
By definition. And the justification, going back to the passages we're citing in Surah 9, the justification for engaging those that are not just pagan Arabs and forcing them to come into Islam by hook or crook, by this means. But he categorizes Christians and Jews in that same category. And so it justifies for the Muslims that would follow and the caliphates that would follow the expansion and enacting all these things. So it's not for him to say that, and I've heard there are a lot of Muslims who say, that Islam is not violent. There's no violence in Islam. It's a religion of peace. All of these statements are then we're encouraged to read the Quran. Oh, you should just read the Quran. And we read it and say, well, what about this? They'll say, oh, that was just for Muhammad's time. I'm told that time and time again. But that just doesn't, if he's meant to be an example for all time and he's setting a precedent, if he's saying that associating a man, Jesus, with Allah is committing shirk and all that, and they're to fight them, it's not just talking about, let's address this maybe. I've been told that certain context, it's just talking about people who broke a treaty with Muhammad. And so that's who he's supposed to go after. That's who he's supposed to fight. And is he supposed to just let him walk all over him and not break a treaty? But again, we're talking about, these are concepts that go beyond.
I mean, this is a complex issue.
Yeah.
Like, yes, there were treaties that were broken, but Muhammad also broke treaties.
Right.
I mean, some of these verses like 2:17 in Baqarah, right? We're talking about a time where he just moved to Medina, and then he's got groups of soldiers, so to speak, going around and roaming around in the wilderness looking for caravans, and they were not to attack during certain months, and it was like the last day of one of the months, and they saw a caravan going through. They're like, hey, we can take some of that stuff, and so they attacked them and took some prisoners and so on and so forth. And the Prophet wasn't happy with it, but that he justified it by saying, fitnatun akbar min al-qital. Let's look at it. 2:17. Yeah, so it says, yasalunaka an al-shahr al-harami. So they'll ask you about the sacred months, right? But he says, fitnatu akbar min al-qital. Al-Katli. Yeah, so I guess I was talking about, let's go back. I was talking about how it's complex because there's all sorts of things that could be perceived as treaty breaking here and there. Like, even from the very beginning, I don't know if I should start that far back, but like when he was in Mecca, there was all sorts of strife. He was persecuted there. And at one point, after he was attacked while he was praying, he got upset, and he said, he looked at Abu Jahil, he says, Jitkul zabih. Nothing's brought me here to you except to slit your throat, to slaughter you. And that's like a threat, right?
Right.
So then later on, we have him meeting with these people coming to do Hajj, and he meets up with the Awsa Hazraj, and that's two groups coming out of Medina, and he meets with them outside of town, and they agree to fight with him, alongside of him, right? And the Quraysh find out about this. They said, hey, Muhammad, you shouldn't make a deal with them. They went to the Ansar, and they weren't happy about this, right? And, I mean, he was looking that was him looking for some sort of military power.
Okay.
So then he moves to Medina with this military power already being established, and he starts making these pacts with the different groups and with the Jews in town and the neighboring places. So he has little groups of troops going around and looking for caravans and running into certain places and making deals with them. They like, okay, you're going to be on our side type of thing.
Okay.
And eventually one of them sees it's like the end of one of the forbidden months. So you're not supposed to go and attack groups, and they attack the group, and then they bring all this stuff to the prophet. And he was like, well, you weren't supposed to do that, right? So that's 2:17. That's what it's talking about.
Okay.
It asks you about fighting in the sacred months. Fighting during this month is a great sin. You're not supposed to do that. But hindering others from the path of Allah and rejecting him and expelling the worshippers from the sacred mosque is a greater sin in the sight of Allah. So that's what I was talking about.
Okay.
Al-fitnatu akbar min al-qatli.
So you're saying what we did was bad, but they're worse people. They're badder. So
Yeah, it's
justified.
bad to kill people, but like it's worse what they're doing.
Right.
Like so it's or to fight people. It's bad to fight people, but it's better than
Right.
what they're doing. It's good. So it's permissible in this case,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
And just to give a reference point to the Christian understanding of how Christians, what Jesus taught, what the New Testament teaches of, Jesus came and taught, and then his apostles taught that there's neither Jew nor Gentile. There's no barbarian. There's no Greek. There's no distinction. In other words, classes, subjugating people, humiliating people who do not submit. Like we're to go into the nations and call them to submit to Christ, call them to be disciples of Christ, but it is not in any sense called to go to set up this caste system, basically, where the Christian in the community is to be elevated above others. And it did over time, Christianity does conquer nations and people that submit to Christ, but it's not through this threat of force. And Christians have used, or at least those who claim the name of Christianity, have used violence.
If the leader, your leader says the greatest among you will be your servant,
Right.
and then that sets a precedent for being a servant,
Right.
and kind of accepting those positions. And so we see that later on in some of the letters in the epistles where he's like talking about, I want everyone to be content in the position that he's in.
Right.
And if you're single, be single. If you're a slave, be content to be a slave and show the light of Christ through there. If you're a master, do these things
Right.
in a Christ-like way. Be a changed person in the situation that you're in, rather than, throwing off, rebelling against the people who are above you, and so on and so forth.
And it's essentially Christianity is not forcing a community to conform to an ideal and a standard one way or the other, but it's a transformation of the individual that affects the community in the whole in a real tangible way, because eventually when Christian principles are enacted, when people are serving one another, those vices and things that are not right eventually are rooted out and exposed and expelled. Like slavery especially the manner of slavery in modern era, is an awful blight on the history of the U.S., the history of Europe, and even there was an Arabic Muslim slave trade that took place in North Africa and ventured into Europe. It was just a reality that over time it was through Christian principles being enacted that were lived out and that transformed society. And so I guess what I'm getting at is when we have these discussions, yes, a Muslim can say, well, what about the Crusades? What about this? What about that? We can critique Christian actions by the teaching of the founder of Christianity and say they didn't behave in the right way. They aren't living Christian principles. This wasn't right. Whereas when you look at the actions of those who are, this is why I think I see so many conflicting responses online to violent attacks and the use of violence. I see on one hand, Muslims saying it's justified. On the other hand, they're trying to sugarcoat it. So talk a little bit about that, because
I have a philosophy in mind. I think it applies to both ways. Like, you can't judge an ideology by its hypocrites. You can't do
Right.
that because they're not following the ideology.
Right.
Right. So that doesn't make sense to judge them by the hypocrites. But who are the hypocrites, right? And so with Christianity, he said that my kingdom is not a kingdom of this world. Otherwise, we would have fought.
Right.
So it's clear that Jesus did not come to bring a sword in the sense of going after people with the sword.
Right.
The sword that Jesus talks about that in the scripture is the sword upon the church. It's the persecution that you go through. It's the people that are going to persecute you because you decide to follow Christ, because you profess Christ. So it's different. I think that with Islam, that it's disingenuous to say that Islam is a peaceful religion, because Islam is not just a peaceful religion. The peace of Islam is within Islam. You don't get the peace without submitting.
It's a religion of peace if you're
You have
submitted to
be,
being a Muslim.
We'll go over a verse that says just that, but I want to point out this particular point.
Yeah.
Because this guy, what he's talking about here, is addressed in the Hadith, and it's pretty clear. So let's go over that.
Okay.
So if you go to Surah Al-Imran, the third book of the Quran, the 110th verse, you'll read, "Kuntum khayrun ummatan ukhrijat lin-nas." You are the greatest community ever raised out of humanity. And we have hadiths that kind of flesh out this and explain what this means. What does that mean to be the best community of all the communities? The best people. And this is what Sahih Bukhari 4557 says. خَيْرَ النَّاسِ لِلنَّاسِ. So they're the best of peoples for the people. In what sense? تَعْتُونَ بِهِمْ فِي السَّلَاسِلِ فِي الْأَنَاكِهِمْ. Because they bring the people, the infidel, in chains around their necks, حَتَّى يَدْخُلُوا فِي الْإِسْلَامِ, until they embrace Islam. So how do they bring them? Bring them by chains. They force them.
Right.
So this means that Islam, the community of Muslims, the idea of compulsion is an integral part of the Muslim mission and the Muslim way of doing things. And history fleshes that out. And so do the hadiths and everything else. So when you come to verses like this, we have to understand them based on all these things, taking all these things into account. And that's why I would say chronology is key here. When we look at this particular verse in the second chapter, verse 256, La ikrah fil din, it's a really beautiful verse. There's no compulsion in religion. This was an early Medinan verse, right? And there's different interpretations about how to take it. Some people will say that, oh, this is actually talking about, the state of the heart of people, that you shouldn't follow Allah just because somebody forced you to do it, but you should do it for the right reasons, because the truth is self-evident, right? So you should just follow it for that reason. But that would mean, when they say that it negates nothing of the other verses,
Right.
requiring an outward form of requiring an outward type of what is it called? Obedience, was that one?
Yeah.
No,
an outward form of like submission, a manifestation of submission to.
Yeah, maybe
conformity to their
outward for conformity.
Yeah.
That it doesn't negate the outward form of conformity. So that wouldn't negate going to war and asking people to do the
Right.
prayers and the shahada and give zakat and all those things. I mean, you can't get around these things. The Muslim commentators that are commenting, they know what Muhammad said about this. Ana umirtu an uqatil an-nas. Muhammad said, I was commanded to fight people. All right? So they're not trying to get around these things. They're trying to harmonize this particular verse with the others. And that makes sense. So the other ways that they would understand it, some people would say, well, this is talking about Jews who were trying to convert people to Judaism in Medina there, or Christians. Others would say, no, it's talking about people trying to force people into Islam at that particular time. And that was something for that particular time. And then others would say, well, no, it's talking about the Ahl Kitab, which those are supposed to pay jizya, and so you can't force them in because they can pay the jizya tax and you can leave them alone. And so that's the tolerance that it's talking about there. And then of course others just kind of take all these things together and understand them based on the chronology, which I said was key here, and is that later verses abrogated these verses.
Right.
Right. So they're to be understood based on the new update
Right.
that we get later on. So, and the update later on is in chapter 9, right?
Right. Which we went over, which categorizes beyond what this guy says, just pagan, being pagan.
When they're using the verse in the news where it says, and kill the non-believers wherever you find them, that's actually God not commanding the Muslims. He's commanding the angels at the Battle of Badr where they're outnumbered 3-1. So God says in the Quran, I sent angels down and commanded them to destroy your opponents. They were outnumbered. There was no way they could have won. It doesn't say, kill the Christian, chop their neck.
Oh, let's stop there. It doesn't talk about Christians chopping their necks there, right? But
Right.
they did, Bani Qurayza, they went and chopped a bunch of Jewish necks.
Right.
Yeah, the Bani Qurayza, what happened there, right? After the Battle of the Trench, or during the Battle of the Trench, like the Jews, let's give some context to this. So, in Medina, there's 3 tribes. There's Bani Qaynuqa, there's Bani Qurayza, and there's Bani Nadir. And these 3 groups that are there, they have a pact with the Prophet. And the pact goes something similar to like the verse that he mentioned, La ikhara fil din. That kind of concept is kind of encapsulated in it. Like, okay, well, we'll let you be your religion, and we're together, we're fighting against the Qurayshi tribes, we have a common enemy, so on and so forth, let's not stab each other in the back. Well, there was all sorts of things that happened, and at one point, in the tribe of Bani Qaynuqa, they were kind of messing around with a Muslim woman, and the Muslims got mad, they got in a fight, and someone died, someone got killed. So Muslims killed somebody. And so he came in, Muhammad comes in to kind of regulate this situation. And when he comes in, he says, Aslamu. You all need to accept Islam. You should all accept Islam, or I'll do to you what I did to the Quraysh in Badr. Of course, what did they know in Badr? Well, this verse is talking about that.
Okay. Right.
Right. So let's read what that verse says.
Yeah.
What did he do? What happened there?
And what's the source for that where he said, I'll do to you what I did in...
It's in Sir Nabuwa Ibn Hisham. So it's in the biography of the Prophet by Ibn Hisham. I can draw up the actual quote here in a minute, and I'll read it. Let's look up. I've got to get my sources up here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
أسلموا قبل أن يصيبكم مثل ما أصاب القريش. Here's a page for it. You want to read it? Okay, so the quote was, so Muhammad comes to the Bani Qaynuqa. There's this problem between them, and he's frustrated by it, and he says, أسلموا قبل أن يصيبكم الله بمثل ما أصاب به قريشا. So he says, you all have to surrender. That word aslamu typically means they need to accept Islam.
Okay.
And he's calling them to become Muslim before he does to them what he did to the people in Badr. So they were with him in Badr fighting the Quraysh, right? And they saw what happened. And this guy kind of skirts the idea of, he's talking about what happened in Badr. And let's look at that. And so in Surah Al-Anfal, this is the 12th verse. People should go and look it up on their own. Okay. So it does say, just like he says, إِذَا يُخَيْ رَبُّكَ إِلَّا الْمَلَائِكَةِ. So remember, O Prophet, when the Lord revealed to the angels, إِنِّي مَعَكُمْ فَثَبِّتُوا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا سَأَلْقِ فِي الْقُلُوبِ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا الرُّعْبَ. Yeah, so that's the point right here. That's it. He says, I am with you, and so make the believers stand firm, and I will cast terror, right? He says, سَأُلْقِ فِي الْقُلُوبِ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا الرُّعْبَ. Arub is like terror or fear.
Okay.
He's going to cast that into their hearts. And how is he going to cast that into their hearts? فَاضْرِبُوا فَوْقَ الْأَنَاكِ. That means to strike on their necks. فَاضْرِبُوا مِنْهُمْ كُلَّ بَنَانٍ. And to strike their fingertips.
Okay.
So like, who struck during the battle of Badr? Who struck the necks of the Quraysh? Was it the angels, or was it the Muslim fighters?
Fighters, yeah.
Right? It was the Muslim fighters, right? And struck their fingers and all these things. What was that about? So he threatens this Jewish tribe in this way.
Okay.
And this guy is referring to this particular verse as being about this Qurayshi tribe. Yeah, sure. That doesn't mean it doesn't apply elsewhere, because after that, what we see is the Jews kind of had something going on. They were unsure about this relationship, because after he said for them to aslamu, like he said for them to repent, Bani Qaynuqa was chased out of town. Right? They had to leave. And so then we have these other two tribes left. And so these other two Jewish tribes are probably thinking to themselves, you can imagine, are we next?
Right.
So whenever the Battle of the Trench happens, they send like some people to go kind of talk with the forces that are attacking the Muslims there. And they're like, hey, if you win, we can do a deal. And so Muhammad got wind of this, and after the battle's over, he turned around and went back and laid siege to Bani Qurayza, the guys who went there. So Bani Qurayza was not a formal battle. They got them all locked up. They kept them in there. They besieged them, and then they surrendered. They came out and they publicly executed people by chopping off their heads.
Okay.
I'll say, so chopping off the heads in this verse is something that Muslims did. And so if you're trying to say that Muslims did not chop off people's heads, or this was just something during the battle, that is disingenuous.
Right.
All right. Of course, these verses have context. That's what I've said before. That doesn't mean that their application is limited to that context.
Because he's making it sound like angels came down and did the work, did the war.
Well, this verse is talking about angels, and so
Yeah.
you can kind of throw somebody off guard. Well, he's talking to the angels about that's some sort of spiritual thing going on. But this was an actual struggle, a war. People were chopping people's heads off, and there were heads chopped off. Okay. It wasn't like in Bani Qurayza, but it still happened. سَأُلْقِي فِي الْقُلُوبِ الَّذِينَ كَافَرُوا الرُّعْبَ. I'm going to cast into the hearts of those infidels fear or terror. So where do you think terrorists get it from?
Right.
They get it straight from the Quran.
Right.
Go down to verse 60. أَعِدُّ لَهُمْ مَا أَسْتَطَاعَ مِنْ قُوَّةٍ مِنْ رِبَةِ الْخَيْلِ وَتُرْهِبُونَ بِهِ عُدْوَى اللَّهِ وَعُدْوَكُمْ. So this one says, prepare what you, what is it adding in here? I'm just going to have to translate myself. Prepare what you can of your military power and of your cavalry to strike fear into your enemies. Allah's enemies and your enemies. That's what verse 60 says. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
The word turhibuna, that's irhab, turhib, it's the same root. It's terror. That's what terrorism comes from.
Right.
The terrorism that we see in the Quran and the horrible things we see terrorists do come out of these contexts.
What he's saying he was called to do.
Yeah. So when it talks about fighting the kuffar, it says, whenever you meet the infidels, strike their necks. Right? These are things that we find in the Quran. And to say that these things didn't happen because of context is disingenuous.
Right. Let's continue.
Actually, God commanding the angels to take out the pagan Arabs that were trying to wipe out the first Muslims. What actually happened was during that time of oppression, because the last thing the actions did in their inception, the Prophet did was command to fight back. But after over a decade of persecution, being murdered by their own family, by their own tribes who were declaring there's only one God, he ordered a very large group of his followers to go to ancient Abyssinia, which is today modern Ethiopia. There was a righteous Christian king known as the Negus, Negus. He was the righteous Christian king that the first Muslims sought refuge in. And when the pagan Arabs came to wipe out, they wanted the Muslims. He said, wait, we believe in Jesus too.
Like,
we believe he's the Messiah. He's like,
it seems a little bit blown out of proportion from what I remember from the Sirah. Yeah, so there wasn't a lot of Christians when there was persecution going on in Mecca. And when he sent people to Habasha to kind of hide out there. And it wasn't like a whole bunch of people were being killed. There was persecution. There was some people who were killed, but it wasn't like this huge widespread, like a bunch of Muslims were all getting persecuted, because there wasn't very many of them at that point.
Right.
So like he sent I don't remember how many it was. It might have been 15 or something, to Habasha to kind of hide out there, and they took him in. Now Najran that he's talking about, he converted to Islam according to the sources. So there was good relations on that and between the Christians of Bani Najran. I considered them kind of submitted or under the authority of Najran, I would guess, who is a Muslim. kind of accepted their religion. So they didn't consider them political enemies. They weren't on the forefront of the wars that we're talking about during the life of Muhammad, right?
So he went there to hide out for a bit.
And the Sahaba, I don't think attacked them either. So.
Okay.
Will not touch these men. Yeah, we don't agree, but you will not lay a single hand. He could have gave them up and kept the friendly relations. Instead, he protected the Muslims. Yet you've never heard that story. You know, I haven't. So if the Christian is the infidel in Islam, why would the Prophet Muhammad command his followers to go seek protection to the Christian?
Yeah, so that's like, how does that help his point? I mean,
right.
Like the Christians helped the Muslims there, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean that the Muslims didn't attack Christians. They did attack Christians.
Right.
They attacked Byzantium. What do you think a Muslim expansion is?
Yeah.
Like there's a hadith. Let's look at that hadith. I'm gonna look up the hadith. This hadith kind of was like at the end of Muhammad's life. So it was like one of the last things you said probably. لُخْرِجَانَ يَهُودَ وَالنَّصَارَى مِنْ جَزْرَةِ الْعَرَبِيَّةِ حَتَّى لَا قَضَاءَ إِلَّا الْمُسْلِمًا. I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and will not leave any but Muslim. So only the Muslims, they're going to expel them all. Okay. So he had in view what he had in view making this whole place just Muslim and pushing the Christians out completely. And I think Omar kind of continued based on this philosophy. So I don't know what he's trying to get at here. If we're going to take all the histories in context, it's not like Muhammad didn't fight Christians or Jews. I think that there's more during the life of the Muhammad, which means during the verses of the Quran, we're going to see more things where he's going after the Jews than, say, the Christians.
Okay.
Because of the strong Jewish communities that were in the area.
Right. Well, historically, when Rome was persecuting both Jews and Christians, and it's the way he frames it, right? He says, oh, these are stories you never hear of. Well, if you study and read, it's all there. And I've heard these stories before I even began a deep dive into Islam. I knew just its basic knowledge when you start to study Islam that Muhammad had to flee to a Christian kingdom for protection. And so he's trying to say...
His followers are fleeing too. He actually stayed in Mecca. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess he's trying to use it to claim that, well, because a Christian king took him, protected them, it means he never went after Christians. It's just pagan Arabs. So we spent 45 minutes just spelling that out, that this is all there. I think, probably for the first while early on, when Rome began to persecute, historically speaking, when they began to persecute both Jews and Christians, because as you read the book of Acts, the Jews were expelled from Rome. That's when Paul met Aquila and Priscilla, for example. And so the Christian community had not become well known enough yet for Rome to turn their eyes on, to even take thought of it. And the majority of the persecution of Rome toward Christian and Jews was not because of Jesus, but it was because Jews and Christians refused to honor Caesar as a god. And so that put both the Jews and the Christians. And Jesus predicted that, there would be an upheaval in Jerusalem, complete, the temple razed. And if you're a Christian, flee to the mountains. The Jews didn't. They stayed and fought. They put up, I can't think of his name right now, but there's some guy that they said was the Messiah. He raised, the resistance, and they were just decimated. So during that persecution, the Christians fled to the catacombs, and the Jews, they fled to Arabia, to the Arabian Peninsula. And a lot of also from my research, a lot of the Christian cults, Gnostics and things also fled. They were smaller in number, but they migrated more toward the Arabian Peninsula. And that's why you have, Muhammad refuting Mary as a part of the Trinity, when that's not mainstream. That's never been a mainstream Christian understanding. So it doesn't even make sense that would be something that the Quran would need to refute if it's not even what Christians believe. But there might have been a Christian sect or a Christian cult that did hold to that belief. But the point is, so early on, he would have interacted with far more Jews. There's a hadith, is it Sahih, that says, in the last days, this isn't something that ends. It's even in the last days, Jesus returns to break the cross, slaughter pigs, and rocks will cry out and say, there's a Jew hiding behind me. So even in the last days, Christians and Jews are still in this category of polytheists, right? I mean, that's why Jesus returns to straighten us out, right? So it would follow that we're still in that category today then.
Yeah, they're the Dalin, they're the lost in Fatiha, yep.
So essentially, the majority of Muslims will acknowledge, I would think, this reality, but they're going to, like this guy and others in the Western context, are trying to frame Islam where these were battles that were defensive. There, treaties were broken, and so he had to do this, but it only applies to his day. It's not for us today, and we're supposed to interact peacefully with nations. And I guess maybe just, you had mentioned before, you don't have to get into detail because you might not have, and then if there's anything else you want to wrap up, but you had mentioned there's 3 levels of interaction with the non-Muslim that a Muslim is supposed to approach. And maybe just touch on that a little, and next time we can go more into detail, just to give a little idea of the Christian who's interacting with the Muslim. I want to get into the Muslim mind so the Christian knows the Muslim mind, so that depending on which level the Muslim is thinking, they know how to interact, appropriately. Because the goal here is not just to, refute this guy. The goal is to have an honest conversation and to bring people to the knowledge of the gospel. But we want to have interaction with Muslims that are based on the reality of what Muslims believe, what the Quran teaches, and what the Bible teaches.
So the Prophet said, "Man ra'a munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadayhi." So that means whenever you see something that Islam doesn't accept, you should to handle it with your might, with your own hand. You should change it by your own hand. Man ra'a munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadayhi. Whatever you see something that Islam doesn't like, change it with your own hand. Walam yastata bilisani. If you can't, then use your tongue. Speak out against it. فإن لم يستطع, if you can't even do that, فبقلبه. So if you can't even do that, بقلبه, that means if you can't even use your speech to do it, then at least in your heart, hate it. And it goes on to say at the very end, وَذَلَيْكَ الْأَضْعَافَ الْإِيمَانِ. So hating something in the heart is the weakest form of faith.
Okay.
Like, so in this sense, what he's trying to say is that the jihad of the self is the lesser jihad, right? Islam prefers forced compliance, and where that's not possible, they can use verbal coercion, and where that's not possible, at least fighting is what Islam considers evil there's that fighting with the evil in the heart, right? So I can go over that again. The jihad of the self is the lesser jihad.
Okay, right.
Islam prefers forced compliance,
Yeah.
and where that's not possible, verbal coercion, and where that's not possible, then one should at least be fighting with it in their heart, hating what Islam hates.
And jihad the word itself has to have context. So there's just saying jihad means to strive, to struggle.
It's just struggle. Yeah, it's just struggle.
But there's these categories of jihad that to deny that jihad includes a forceful picking up of the sword weapons to enforce Islam.
Yeah,
it's just to deny reality.
That would be put you in the category of a nafiq, because if you're called to jihad and you don't go, then that's considered nafiq. That's considered hypocrisy. I sent you a hadith, that I've used. It's kind of like a buya, because it says, this is Sunan An-Nasai, 3,561. So after the battle, a particular battle, then they came to Muhammad and they said, "Oh, look, we're finished. The war's over, right?" And what did he respond to them? He said, "Those people who said the war is over, they're lying. It's just now that fighting has come, and there will always be a group among the Ummah, among the Muslims, who will fight for the truth. And God will cause some people to deviate and grant them provision, and then they'll So the Muslims will be able to have provision by attacking and plundering these peoples until the hour begins, until the promise of Allah comes.
Yeah.
So until the last day, there will always be
This
war. Yeah. So, and a lot of people quote this. You'll see it in tafsirs in regards to the Surah Muhammad, the 4th verse. That's the 47th surah. In regards to the idea where it says they're putting down their weapons, right? And it says, وَضَعَتَ الْخَرَبْ أَوْزَارَهَا in this particular hadith. That's so people remember that. That's whenever the war puts down its burdens, they say that means that's when Jesus comes back and kills the Dajjal, which means the end times.
Right.
So that kind of sets that to continue fighting in the manner that we see explained in 47:4 whenever you meet the infidels and strike them at their necks, to continue doing that حتى وضعت الحرب أوزارها, until war lays down its burdens, in the sense that Jesus comes, returns, and kills the Dajjal, and it's all over. That the last war has ended. Okay. So they're from here to then, they're to fight, which is really contradictory to Christianity, right?
Right.
Christianity, yeah, we all agree God has the right to kill and do all these things. He's God. He can do whatever he wants. He gives, he can take away. We believe that. And so it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with people being killed.
Right.
But Jesus clearly showed us that we are also guilty. And how can the guilty, who's asking for God's forgiveness, go and exact this type of vengeance on people?
In fact,
he doesn't have the right to
anymore.
That's like what we see with the woman that was caught in adultery.
Yeah.
Who has without sin cast the first stone. And there's nobody of us that can. But what Jesus he says that I didn't come, my kingdom is not a kingdom of this world. Otherwise we would have fought. And so from here until he returns, we don't have the right to take out the sword. He took it away from Peter. He took it away from everyone. That's what Tertullian said.
And that's what Peter talks about. The judgment begins at the house of God. That's where, and Paul talks about, you're supposed to, rather than go to court with a believer in front of the unbelievers, then suffer the wrong, which is just a completely opposite concept. That's just,
don't repay evil for evil.
Right.
Yeah.
So in Christian thought, then, within the church, we're to judge one another, we're to be, but not in a condemnatory sense. The community of Christians is to bring about judgment for reconciliation and restoration, not necessarily for restitution of loss and all of that, because Christ took all of our sin and bore the penalty of it on the cross. He bore it through his death. And so the Christian now is to go out and demonstrate that to the world as an individual and in community with believers. And so anytime, and I try to bring this up with my Roman Catholic friends, and Calvinists did the Reformation, like, history is not what legitimizes our faith, because there's bad actors all the time. What legitimizes our faith is the teaching of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus Christ. So when you look at the history of warfare, and yes, you can develop, I believe, a just warfare philosophy for governments, because Jesus does not do away with the nation state. He says submit to it because it's God's instrument. So if a nation goes to war, then there needs to be, just war behind it and all that. That's a different category than the community of the church. And I think this is where Christians don't understand that Islam is a political, militaristic, religious entity. There's no separation of it, right? And so the only separation is what you just talked about, those three categories. If you're a Muslim and find yourself in a people where you're not in charge, then you have to do the striving, the struggle, the jihad in one of those three categories. But the goal is always, the trajectory is always moving toward that final battle, which is when Jesus finally comes to, take care of the Dajjal. So for him to say that, Islam is just peace, we don't fight, Muhammad never fought unjustly. It was just even going after the pagan Arabs just because they're pagan.
Yeah, I mean, it's really controversial if you're going to look at it from like an objective lens.
Yeah.
I mean, he attacked caravans. He attacked first. He traveled hundreds of kilometers to go attack these Jewish towns that weren't right in his face, doing anything to him at the time. And if you read between the lines, you can see he's doing some of the same things he's accusing other people of. Like the thing with Bani Kainuqa, you can kind of understand the reason behind the Jews wanting to look for an ally outside of the Muslims.
Right.
Because they just got one of their tribes kicked out of the town. So they didn't have any incentives to convert to Islam, and they didn't really believe it. And then at the same time, he turned on them, and so they're looking on it for a way out. And he did chase them all out, right?
Yeah,
chased them all out of Medina.
Right. Well, very good. I think that's our hour mark. We'll wrap it up there. That was really good. I think it was a good conversation and covered a lot of ground. Just to try to frame, I guess it's such a hot topic today because lawmakers, it's controversial. You got the Texas lawmaker, the lady who's running, and this guy's brought her up where she's, she's very antagonistic toward Islam. And as a whole, I think lawmakers need to be aware, probably like our job, like I'm called to share the gospel, not to be a lawmaker and tell lawmakers how they ought to understand what the Muslim community is doing within their nations. But the reality is there's an overall objective. Christians believe Christianity, that Jesus will rule and reign. But until he returns, it's not with the sword, it's with the sword of the word of God. It's the exact
opposite of what we're talking about here. Right. So like from here till Christ's return, we're supposed to put away our swords and beat them into plowshares, right? And then Muslims, they're to fight until this ends.
Right.
Yeah. So when I said earlier, I said you can't judge a religion or an ideology based on its hypocrites. I meant that. Right. And I think that the problem is that people don't understand. Muhammad described himself pretty well. There's a hadith that talks about 5 things that were particular that no one had before Muhammad had. No prophet had before him. And one of them is nusirtu bi-rob. He conquered through fear.
Okay.
All right. He boasted of this. He wasn't ashamed of this.
Right.
Right. So, and when he said, "Ana umirtu an uqatil nas hatta yashhadu la ilaha illallah wa Muhammadur Rasulullah," and I was commanded to fight people until they gave the shahada and they prayed the aqimu salat until they did the prayers, performed the prayers, the Muslim prayers he's talking about there, utu zakat, and give the zakat. If they do that, asmun min dima'ihim wa amwalihim illa bihaqqil Islam. If they do that, then their belongings and their lives, with their blood, is protected.
Okay.
So he commanded these things. This is part of Islam, and so I don't know how you get around it. It's hypocritical. It might be hypocritical to actually say that Islam is a peaceful religion.
Right. So it's hypocritical for a Christian to use violence to try to advance Christianity, and it's hypocritical for a Muslim to say
we're a peaceful religion.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And I think the point is, for those who are, honest, sincere Muslims who do believe it's a peaceful religion, to take a look at their own sources. Just read your own book and look at what the description of your prophet from the sources that are given yourself. Now a lot of Muslims will embrace that. They're fine with that. And that's a reality that you can choose to follow that path then.
You can kind of bounce back and forth. That's what my suggestion would be, is that you take the ayat of the Quran that are peaceful, that you like, the nice ones that everybody in the West wants to use. Right. You can take all of these and then put them in chronologically where they fit in.
Right.
All right. And after you do that, kind of work it out. Work it out. What does this mean? What's the latest update of what we have? And what did the Sahaba do? Right. What did Islam do after that? What were they following? And it kind of spells it out for you. All right. You don't have to go and wrestle with a bunch of Christians and what they're thinking. Right. You can just go and look at it yourself. Because I thought Islam was a peaceful religion when I came to it, because people who taught me la ikrah fil din. But they didn't teach me everything. Right? They just said that. And so I ended up discovering on my own, and it was very discouraging for me.
And I think that's a good approach. If you're going to engage in Islamic evangelism as a Christian, approach it with giving the benefit of the doubt to those teaching you, but go to the sources and then hold them and ask questions to the sources. Don't just repeat. As a Christian, don't just regurgitate and repeat common polemics you hear against Islam, because Muslims do it all the time toward Christians, and it's not a sincere way of engaging the content. And my goal with this is to get Muslims and Christians to engage the content, those who sincerely are seeking to know what is being truthfully taught. And sometimes a Muslim who's exposed to these things will become more fundamental in the way they approach it. And sometimes they'll leave and realize that I've been duped or I've been lied to. And so I'll end it with this. I have been getting a lot of comments lately because I've been doing a couple response videos of this nature. And I've been getting, Muslims have been commenting saying, well, Jesus said, bring those who would not submit to me, and I'll slay them before me.
Yeah, it's like they're parroting some Dawah guy said, not realizing that it's a parable.
Number one, it's a parable. But number two, it's exactly what we just talked about. Christianity is to bring the message of salvation and reconciliation with God. We're ambassadors because God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself. And so we beseech you to be reconciled to God until Jesus comes. But when Jesus comes, if you in this lifetime did not be reconciled to God through Jesus Christ, then that parable is going to be fulfilled. And we have no qualms about that. What Muslims are thinking is, oh, you're supposed to go out and fight.
The parable is a parable. It's
right.
It's an example of what's happened. It's talking about the day of judgment. It's not a literal thing that it's talking about. And so it's really, really conniving to take a parable and apply it to actually something that was commanded, as something prescribed, as something descriptive there. So that's disingenuous and not fair.